Hi, everyone. I'm just going to begin by introducing myself. Hopefully, some of you know me, and I know some of you. My name is Christian Garcia. I'm the third vice president of the local. And so I work to represent postdocs at the University of Toronto. And I'm joined also by Shanice Regis-Wilkins, our staff rep, as well as Zia Sumar and Elizabeth Long of the law practice Mango G. And in a moment, I'm going to pass things off to Zia and Elizabeth to walk us through the presentation and workshop. But I do just want to also take this opportunity to discuss the contract negotiations that you as Unit 5 members, postdocs of the University of Toronto, are currently engaged in. The university relies on the expertise of international workers, and I assume that's why some of you are here as international workers to explore what I know can be sometimes a difficult process of navigating immigration law and things like permanent residence. But like I say, the university relies on your work, the international pool of expertise and training that populates postdocs at the university. But when postdocs arrive in Toronto, the epicenter of the cost of living crisis in Canada, they soon realize that the world-class research that the university prides itself, often doesn't go hand in hand with world-class jobs. As you probably know, as I've mentioned, you as a postdoc are currently negotiating a new contract with the university, and you have asked for table dates with the university in September. One of the big focuses that you've highlighted for this round of bargaining is improvement to wages and benefits. So this is your first contract negotiation that will take place outside of Bill 124, which, if you don't know, is the potentially illegal bill which limited your wages to 1% increases over the past 3 years. This has really made, in conjunction with the cost of living crisis in Toronto, this has really made the wages that we receive as postdocs almost unlivable. But the good news is that in this round of bargaining, you have an opportunity to bargain outside of Bill 124 for the first time. And that's why it's so important that you work with your colleagues and coworkers to show the university that you know the true value of your research and expertise at the university. And that's really one of the big focuses, the main focus really of this round of negotiations, what you've expressed to the bargaining committee through the surveys and in other contexts as well. But this brings us to, the question about your value as a researcher at the university and just how core postdocs have become to the research expertise or excellence of the university. Our second priority in bargaining, and it's about respect and recognition. So one of the things that postdocs fought for when they first organized and unionized at the university is for status as employees, right? Because, and what's true of many postdocs still at the university who are not covered under the bargaining group, is that the university treats postdocs as trainees, right? It's like, we should be lucky to be here to use the resources of the university, rather than acknowledging the core role that we play in the research mandate of the university. So under this category of research, respect and recognition, there's a number of proposals that will be designed to improve the status of postdocs at the university. So things like access to funds for the research that we do at the university. The recent bargaining survey that you may have filled out indicated that almost 50% of you were paying out of pocket for the research you do for the university. And that's one of the things that we're going to try to address in this round of bargaining. There's many ways to get involved. And if these proposals or these priorities sound important to you, the important thing to remember is that we won't really have pressure, the ability to kind of win meaningful gains at the table, unless the university sees that postdocs are united and willing to take action to win these changes. So that's why I'm going to end by just highlighting a few of the ways that you can get involved. One of the main things is that your bargaining support committee is currently recruiting contact action team members. And in a moment, I'll drop in the chat, if that's possible, the email of our lead steward who you can reach out to get in contact with about joining the contact action team. And the great thing about this is that it's a pretty low stakes, high stakes actually, but low time commitment way of getting involved in the campaign. You just have to be willing to pass on information to your colleagues that you know at the university to keep them informed about what's going on in the bargaining process. So like I said, you can reach out to me for that or to our lead steward, Andre. I don't think the chat's going to be open for most of this presentation, but you can reach out to me if you'd like to learn more about this at vp3@cupe3902.org. And then another way you can get involved is by signing the pledge, the bargaining pledge. It's just an easy and simple way for you to tell the university that you're ready to bargain and negotiate for a fair contract with the university. So I'm going to pass things off back to Elizabeth in a moment here, and Elizabeth and Zia. But I also just want to, of course, thank both of them for their time. I know they've given a number of these workshops for us and our members at the university and for postdocs. So, thank you so much for being willing to share your time and expertise with us. Without further ado, Elizabeth, I'll hand things back over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Christian. It's always a pleasure to be here. So we're immigration lawyers in Toronto. Our office is by the Eaton Center. These days, however, we don't see many clients face-to-face anymore. It's mostly Zoom. But we've been working with UofT students well over well over a decade. We've been doing these kind of webinars with CUPE and also with the GSU as well. It's always a pleasure to come and speak to you guys here at the beginning when you guys are thinking about how to get permanent residence and how to make sure that you stay in status, because planning is really, really key with regard to immigration. So today what we're going to go through is we're going to go and talk a little bit about what you need to do to extend your status in Canada as temporary residents. And then we're also going to talk about permanent residence and different options. Before we just go into the slides, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions at all, please put your questions into the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen. Zia and I will do our best to answer the questions at the end of the presentation. So let's get started. Let's talk about temporary residence.
So when we're talking about temporary residence, in a nutshell, first thing, it is really important to make sure that you keep your status while you're here in Canada. So, if you're on a work permit, your work permit's expiring, really important to make sure that you're submitting an extension application prior to that expiry date that's listed on your work permit. Now, as long as you submit that extension application prior to the expiry date, you apply properly, you'll have what's called implied or maintained status. Now, what this means is that you can continue living, working in Canada. Basically, you're following the same conditions as your initial work permit, and you're able to continue doing that so long as you remain in Canada and up until a decision is made on your extension application. So again, if you have a work permit, your work permit's expiring, really important to make sure that you're submitting your extension application prior to that expiry date and making sure that you're submitting that application properly so that you benefit from implied status or maintained status, which will allow you to continue working in Canada until a decision is made on that extension application. Now, if you have a work permit, you realize, oh no, I missed the expiry date, it was a couple days ago, I thought I still had a week. But for whatever reason you've missed that deadline, there is a period of 90 days to submit what's called a restoration application. So where you've lost your status, you can apply to get your status back by submitting a restoration application. But really important, you only have a period of 90 days from when you lose your status to submit that restoration application. So if you miss the deadline on your the expiry date of your work permit, you would have 90 days from that expiry date to submit your restoration application. Now, what's really important to note in terms of the difference between submitting an extension application versus a restoration application is that when we talk about implied status or maintained status, we said that you're able to continue working in Canada while you're waiting for that extension application. If you miss your deadline and you're submitting a restoration application, you cannot work in Canada until you get a decision on that restoration application. So until you get a new work permit, you won't be able to resume working. You'll actually have to stop working immediately. So big difference between submitting an extension and a restoration, but really important to make sure that you are taking note of what the expiry dates are of your permits and submitting extension applications prior to that.
Yeah, just let's maybe have a little bit of conversation about this implied status, because a lot of people get confused. They think when we say if you can't apply properly, that if you don't have every single document in the application, that they shouldn't apply. What do you mean when you say they need to apply properly in order to get implied status?
Yeah, so that means submitting the right fees, submitting the application form, actually filing an application online. In some cases, you may not have everything. You may be missing a supporting document that you need. You can put an explanation to say that, look, this is why I don't have the document at the current time, but you can always update the work permit application later with that particular document. But really making sure that you have that extension application filed online before the expiry of your permit.
Right. So basically, if you guys, don't pay the right fees or submit the wrong forms, your application can be returned, which means it's as if you haven't submitted it at all. But let's say your passport is going to expire and your work permit is going to expire. You don't have time to get your new passport before your work permit expires. You can still submit your application just to keep yourself in status. And then, the work permit inside Canada right now takes 5 or 6 months. If during that time you get your new passport, you can update your application, and hopefully the officer will see that you have a new passport, and grant you the work permit at the end. It's certainly not recommended to submit applications without proper documentation. However, whether it's a mix between submitting every single document that you need and not submitting it in time, you might, think about, normally we would advise saying, okay, keep your status no matter what, and then you can update your application afterwards, okay? Also on the restoration part, the 90 days from when you lose your status, that is that if they submitted their application properly, does it start? And if they're missing a document, the officer rejects it in the end. Let's say their work permit expires on July 31st. They submit the work permit extension on July 29th, and they get a decision saying, oh, we reject it because you don't have a proper passport, for example, on December 31st. When does the 90 days from the restoration start?
So if they've applied properly, if they have a decision that's refusing the application, then the 90 days starts from that refusal. Right? If you don't apply, or if your application is incomplete, for example, you don't pay the fees, then that 90 days starts from the expiry date of your permit.
And Dia, do you want to speak to this letter that a lot of them will get when we file these?
Definitely. So this is a question that we get a lot. So when you submit an extension application, IRCC will automatically issue a letter that basically states you're able to continue working in Canada The idea behind this letter was that it's another form of proof that you're able to continue working in Canada. It's great for employers because you can provide it to them. It shows again from IRCC that you're able to continue working. The issue with this letter is that it contains an arbitrary date on it. So really what IRCC has done is put automatically that this letter is valid up for a period of 120 days. Now, like Elizabeth mentioned earlier, currently we're seeing processing times of about 5.5 months for work permit extensions. So there's a disconnect between the date that's on the letter and when we're actually expecting to receive a decision on that extension application. Now, a question we always get is, well, with that expiry, with the date that's listed on the letter, do I have to stop working on that date because that's what the letter seems to indicate? And the answer is no. The law is that as long as you are waiting for a decision on your extension application, again, if applied properly, you're waiting for a decision, you're able to continue working up until that decision is actually reached. So yes, the letter had potentially a good intention, but that 120 days is certainly very confusing on the letter. And so by law, you are able to continue working in Canada until you get a decision on the extension application.
Perfect. Okay, so let's talk about extending your work permit. Most of you will have your postdoc work permits, and that's a special LMIA exempt work permit, but you are limited to doing the postdoc work that is indicated in your work permit. So, for example, if you're hired by UofT and you wanted to change to another university, you would have to apply for another work permit for that, right? And it's based on your contract, however long your contract was for, then it would be based on that. Some of you may have post-grad work permits. If you had graduated in Canada and from a program, you may have applied for open post-grad work permit, which is great. There is a special policy to extend work permits for post-grad work permit holders until the end of the year. Normally, that is not the case. Normally, your post-grad work permit is your only post-grad work permit. This is a special policy that is allowing students or former students who have post-grad work permits that are expiring by the end of this year to apply for an extension for 18 months. The labor market impact assessment is the default way for most people to apply for work permits. And it's not a very easy way to do so. You would have to have an employer who is not only willing to offer you a job, but is willing to offer you a job where they can show and demonstrate that they cannot find a Canadian to do the job. So if you were to, go outside of the postdoc world, work, then the employer normally would have to advertise and show they can't find a Canadian who can do this job. They advertise for a month, and then they file the LMIA application with the Labor Department before you can get a work permit. There is an exception to the recruitment requirement for LMIAs. There's a special category of LMIAs that is the GTS, the Global Talent Stream, where if you are going to be working in one of the STEM occupations that are listed as part of the GTS, the employer does not have to try to recruit Canadians. They would have to show that there's a labor market benefit plan that they negotiate with the government, where they say that, oh, we're going to hire Canadians, we're going to train Canadians, etc. And then we can get an LMIA for that. Okay. Now, beyond the LMIA, there are other work permits that we can get. For example, if you go and get to a certain stage in your permanent residence, such as express entry or provincial nominee programs, we'll talk about that. The provincial nominee programs are the programs for the bridging work permit where you have applied under an open sort of category. We don't need a job offer. For example, if you had applied as a PhD student or master student in the OI and PhD stream or master stream, Zia will talk about that. And you received the invitation to apply, you applied, you received the provincial nomination, submitted to IRCC, and the IRCC office has acknowledged that they received it and they sent you acknowledgement of receipt, then you can get the bridging work permit. With express entry, if you have received an invitation to apply and you've submitted your application only after you've received the invitation to apply, then we can also apply for the bridging work permit. The free trade agreement is something where if you are a national of certain countries, such as US, Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Chile, Panama, Korea, the European Union, UK, I know I'm missing some, Australia, Japan. It just depends on the list of what your profession is. If it is on the list, then you may be able to get a work permit that is not LMIA. And Francophone work permits, similarly, if you are fluent in French, then as long as you have a job offer that's outside of Quebec from a Canadian employer, then we can apply for a work permit for you directly, not going through the LMIA. There are also special programs right now for citizens of certain countries. Ukraine, that's already stopped for now, but Hong Kong, Iran, Syria, Turkey, Sudan, these programs are still open. So if you're nationals of those countries, you may be eligible for open work permits as well.
So while you're here in Canada on a work permit, really important to be using that time wisely, because of course, when you're looking for your next step, which generally is applying for permanent residence, you want to make sure that you're putting yourself in the best position. Now, when we'll talk about, Elizabeth will get into permanent residence in a moment, but before we do, I want to talk about the different types of work. So in theory, IRCC has taken every occupation and they've created the NOC classification system. So this is where they've basically codified all the different occupations that they believe are around. And so when they've codified the system, it's a 5-digit code, and each code is then assigned a different tier. So there's 6 different tiers. And of this, when you look at the tier system, anything that falls under tiers 0, 1, 2, 3 is considered high skilled, whereas anything that falls under tier 4 and 5 is considered to be low skilled. Now, this becomes a very important distinction when we're talking about permanent residence, and we'll get into that, like I said, in a moment. The tier system actually came into being at the end of last year, so around November of last year. We used to see that basically it was a different classification system before that. When I over to the tier system, some occupations that were previously low skilled transitioned over to high skilled, like truck drivers, dental assistants, and others that are listed on the slide. And then also some occupations that were high skilled transitioned over to low skilled. We've included a link on the slide here. It has a complete list of all the different occupations and what they are in both in the current tier system. Generally postdocs, RAs, generally all considered to be high skilled, but it does depend on the duties and what exactly it is that you're doing in the role.
And just to give you guys, just to let you know, we will be sending out a recording of today. I do need some time to just edit the video, and we also send out the slides as well to everyone who has registered. Okay. All right, so let's talk about permanent residence. The first category I'm going to talk to you guys about is the express entry stream. Most people have heard about the express entry stream. It is the most popular pathway because it is fast if you get invited to apply. If you get invited to apply, the processing time is anywhere from 2 to 6 months right now, we're finding for most people. However, the question is, can you get an invitation to apply? So here's how the system works in general. First, you have to create an online profile. You get to create an online profile if you qualify under certain categories: federal skilled worker class, Canadian experience class, federal skilled trades class. Now, when you create an online profile, you get to enter the express entry pool. It's very important that you guys understand that when you enter the pool, it is not, and I repeat, not the same as having applied. It does not mean that you have applied for permanent residence. All you have done when you enter the express entry pool is say, hey, I'm interested in applying and I qualify to get into the pool. When you get into the pool, you'll get a series of points based on your background and if you have provincial nomination. Every couple of weeks or so, the government will have a draw where they invite certain people to apply. They're going to be inviting people to apply based on the points, based on the category, how they entered, based on provincial nomination. And now also they may also invite based on category, which category, and we'll talk about that as well, okay? So it's only after you get this invitation to apply that you're able to actually submit your application, okay? So the trick is not just to get into the pool. If you get into the pool, you get to stay in the pool for a year. Afterwards, if you don't get out of the pool and get an invitation to apply, your profile will expire, okay? So how do you get into the pool first? And then we'll talk about how to get out of the pool. Okay, so how to get into the pool. There are 3 categories. The first category, the federal skilled worker class, many of you may already qualify even if you don't have 1 year of work experience in Canada. The work experience required for this category is 1 year of high skilled work experience in one occupation that is full-time, at least 30 hours a week. You can count, for example, 2 years of 15 hours, added together. But the total hours is 1,560 hours, okay? So notice what I didn't say in this. I didn't say that the work experience had to be when you're not a full-time student. I didn't say it had to be in Canada. I didn't say that it couldn't be when you're self-employed, okay? Because all of that work experience can be counted towards having you be eligible to enter the pool. We have people who've never stepped foot in Canada who can get into the pool. We have people who have only had work experience as, TARA work as PhD students and have been able to enter the pool based on this, okay? Other than that, you're looking at your language scores, which you all should have to get into the pool, not to get out, just to get into the pool. Also financial savings, etc. Okay. The second category is the Canadian experience class. The Canadian experience class is something which requires those who apply to have 1 year of high-skilled work experience when they are not full-time students in Canada. And the work experience, of course, has to be in Canada, and you need to have been employed in Canada, okay? So this work is very different. The work experience in this one is very different from the work experience in the FSW. The work experience in Canadian experience class does require you to have a T4, for example, where your income tax, your CPP, EI is taken out. That's what they're really looking for, that you're an employee. Now, in the past, Sometimes if you have been a TARA, we could count that work. Even if you get, I think they have these T5s, etc., because you are still an employee of the university. However, the work experience that you get while you're a full-time student, that does not count towards this work experience. Third one, I'm not going to get into too much. It's skilled trades. Not very many people qualify under this. This is for people who are in the construction trades. Okay, so now that you're in the pool, how do you get the points to get out of the pool? The first one is age. Unfortunately, after you reach your 30th birthday, the government doesn't really think that you should have happy birthdays, okay? Because every year that you get older, you get in your 30s, you get -5, -6. In your 40s, you get -10, -11 points. By the time you reach 45, you don't have to worry about age anymore. But the problem is you get a 0. Compared to people in their 20s who get 110 points, 100 points, that could be, the age factor can be quite significant. Not a lot you can do about age. The only thing I can say is, don't wait, because if you can apply earlier, apply earlier. Education, that's important. If you have 2 degrees, your points certainly do jump, and all of you will have probably the highest level for education because you have your PhD. Language, if you don't have that 1 year of Canadian work experience, like I described in the Canadian experience class, you're really, in order to have any chance, your language points are at the CLB 9 level. So for IELTS, it would be 7s for reading, writing, and speaking, and an 8 in listening. In CELPIP, it would be 9s throughout. Relevant Canadian work experience. This is the same work experience that I described in Canadian experience class. Canadian experience class, you need to have 1 year in the last 3 years. This relevant Canadian work experience, you can have the years that count in the last 10 years. Foreign work experience, high skilled foreign work experience outside Canada can give you points. Education for your spouse, language, Canadian work experience. This could add a little bit, or if they don't have it, conversely, they could take away a little bit if they are your company dependent. Provincial nominee programs. So provincial nominee programs are programs where the province themselves, because they have made an agreement with the federal government, get to choose who they want to have permanent residence. So the provincial nominee programs are divided into express entry based and non-express entry based. And we're going to talk about the Ontario program today for you guys, okay? So only the express entry based programs will give you 600 points added to 2-year score if you get a nomination certificate through those programs. 600 points added to your score will virtually guarantee that you will get an invitation to apply. Previous study in Canada, if you studied in a master's or PhD program in Canada, you get your 30 points. Arranged employment. Now, this is very important. With your postdoc work permits, you can have arranged employment if you have worked for that employer for at least 1 year and you hold an employer-specific work permit. So post-grad work permits don't work, but if you hold a postdoc work permit, it's employer-specific, okay? You still need to have, at the time of application, not only do you need to have worked for 1 year for the employer, you still need to have another 1.5 year contract with the employer in order to get arranged employment, okay? brothers or sisters or Canadians or permanent residents in Canada, you get 15 points for that. Fluency in French is super important. If you are fluent in French, it's may very well be worth it to do the French exam. Not only will you get a lot of points for this, you may also then be eligible for the French draws, which I will talk about in a moment. And then finally, trade certification, that's for people in the construction trades, cooks or chefs, okay? Now, on top of this scoring, the government has put another layer on express entry, starting from late last month, and that is the new category-based draws. So the government has said, we have identified certain people who we really would prioritize their ability to being able to immigrate. And so if they are in the pool, the government has special draws for people who fall into certain criteria. So, for example, there's a French language proficiency draw. The government, for example, has done 2 draws so far, where they have invited a few thousand people who have passed the French exam to the CLB level 7, and they're in the express entry pool. Because there's only a limited amount of people who are in this category, the points for those draws dropped. Like normal draws are at 480s to 500s. Those draws went down to 300 and something. Okay. Similarly, they're going to do draws for certain occupations, healthcare occupations, STEM occupations, trade occupations, transport occupations, agriculture, agri-foods occupations. I put here this link where you can look at this link and see if your occupation falls into one of these occupations. In order to be considered for a draw for these occupations, you have to have 6 months of work experience in the last 3 years in one of these occupations. Now, many of you may be doing certain research, and you may be classified in, as an engineer, or you may be classified as a academic, postdoc researcher. Those are very different occupations, okay? So, when someone comes to us and we have a consultation with them, it's very important to be able to narrow down what occupation. Like Zia was saying, it's all codified by the government. There are like these numbers that correspond to each occupation. And the officer will be determining whether or not, based on the evidence that we submit, you fall under one of these occupations, which occupation you fall under. And that can be very important when it comes to now when we're looking at category-based draws. So finally, the last layer that I'd like to talk about for express entry is the Ontario's express entry stream. The OINP is Ontario's provincial nominee program. So how Ontario works with their express entry streams is they don't allow you to just apply directly with them, okay? You have to be in the pool first, and they will need to see if they're interested in you. It's kind of like, that dating site Bumble? You know how like in the Bumble, I think the men aren't allowed to contact the women directly. They have to wait until the women contact them, and then they can talk. This is kind of like that. So in, for example, let's say the applicant, you guys are more like the guys in Bumble, right? And the government is like the women. So you can't just go and contact the government directly. You have to be in the express entry pool, and then the government is going to come in and see your profile, and decide whether or not they want to swipe right. I think right is good, right? They want to swipe right on you or not. Okay. So who are they going to swipe right on? How do you know if they're going to swipe right on you? So there are different categories that the government has announced that they want to do this. Now, this program has been in place for many years, and it looks like the federal government's category-based draws is super similar to these categories. So there may be changes coming. We don't know exactly what the numbers are going to look like for this. But one of the things that we will do is, after we have the seminar, when there's new news, the only way for us to really let you know is to send you an email. And we'll put you on lists where we send out emails of upcoming programs that might be of interest to people such as yourself. Okay, feel free to unsubscribe if it doesn't interest you. But we do this for people who attend our webinars, just so we can keep you guys updated. So what are the categories? Well, the first one is human capital stream. They haven't really defined exactly who they are going to select. They have said that they like tech, people in IT. So there are certain occupations and tech draws that they have before selected. They also do draws for other occupations. Maybe one time they were selecting people who had job offers. It may change later on, but that's something that we don't exactly know and they won't announce it ahead of time. The other one they have said is the French speaking. So if you're a French speaker, well, you French speakers, you really have it good. Really, you can get your work permits easily through the Francophone program. You have all these French draws, and even the Ontario government loves you. Okay, so that's something that is there. Skilled trades. These are people who are in the Pacific. Maybe you have a spouse who is in one of the trades. It's mostly the construction trades that we're looking at. If they have 1 year of work experience in Ontario, they might also be invited to apply. All right, so yeah, over to you.
So some of you may be looking or thinking about, okay, all these programs that Elizabeth has talked about, none of it really seems like it works for me, or what are the other options that are out there? Well, when we talk about Ontario's programs, like Elizabeth mentioned, there are programs that work with Express Entry and those that are outside of Express Entry. So what Elizabeth has talked about is Express Entry, and then she's looked at the provincial streams for Ontario that are specific to the Express Entry streams. What I want to look at now are Ontario's options outside of Express Entry. So looking at our non-Express Entry streams with the OMP program. Now, very generally, there's 5 different streams that fall under these non-Express Entry routes. The process of applying for any of these is the same, or it's at least similar, okay? So the first step when you're eligible in any of the non-Express Entry streams for Ontario is to create a profile and enter into Ontario's pool of applicants. Now, Ontario, the way that they've set it up is that there is a separate pool for each of the streams. So if you qualify in multiple streams, you'd be creating multiple profiles and going into multiple pools within Ontario's expression of interest system. Okay, so when you're eligible, the first step is creating a profile and going into a pool. Now, when you're in that pool, you're given a point allocation. Okay, so your profile is assigned a score. In each of the different streams, there is a different way. What Ontario does is they have a set of criteria, but they apply these criteria differently based on the program that you're applying through. So for example, some of the streams may include things like your salary if you have a job offer, whereas other streams won't look at that. What we do see as being a big benefit with the Ontario programs is that there is no there's no points being allocated for age, right? So when Elizabeth was going through the express entry system, you know, she talked a lot about the age and not having a happy birthday after 30. Ontario doesn't look at that. Okay, so Ontario's point system does not include age at all in the criteria that they give points for. Now, once you're in the pool, you got your score, you're waiting. Basically what you're waiting for is for Ontario to do draws. Now, Ontario will be doing and has been doing draws throughout the year, but there is no announcements in advance. And with these draws, what we've been seeing this year is that it's not just based on points, but it can also include other criteria like your occupation as well. So what this means is that if you qualify, if you're eligible, if you're thinking about applying through the Ontario system, it is really important to create that profile to get into the Ontario expression of interest system as soon as you can, because you never know when that draw is going to happen. Like I said, there is no announcement in advance to say, okay, Ontario is going to be doing a draw in the next couple of days, or this is the occupations or the scores that they're going to be looking at. And so in order for you to be in the best position and to be considered for as many draws as possible, you want to get into that expression of interest system as early as possible. Okay, so let's take a look at the different streams. When we're talking about these non-express entry streams, the first two that I want to focus on are Ontario's master's and PhD streams. So this is for individuals who have completed their master's or their PhD here in Ontario. You do have to apply within 2 years of your graduation. Okay. Now, with both of these streams, there is no job offer required. So, you know, you may have just finished your program. Maybe you don't have any work experience just yet. You don't have a job offer just yet. All of that is fine. There is no requirement for work experience or a job offer to go through and be eligible under either of the master's or the PhD streams. Okay, so as soon as you're done your program, you can look at these different streams. Now, one thing though is that Ontario is looking for people who are not doing any further studies. So if you finished your master's, you're going to be starting your PhD. This would not be the program for you because, you know, if you're starting your studies right away, then Ontario would not be considering you for the master's stream. But if it's something that you're looking to do in maybe a couple years, then that's fine. It's just we're looking at it right at the time that you're applying. Are you entering the labor market? Are you looking for a job, or are you looking to pursue further studies at that time? And again, with these master's and PhD streams, like I mentioned earlier, they are non-express entry based, and so it does go through the expression of interest system that we've just talked about. Aside from the master's and PhD streams, Ontario has 3 streams that fall under their employer-based categories. Again, these are also still non-express entry based. There's 3 streams, like I said, that fall under the employer-based, and in each of these, there are requirements on the applicant. So you as the person who's applying, the employer, so the company who's supporting the application, and on the position that you've been offered. Okay, so there's 3 different sets of requirements. The requirements are the same for the employer, so let's take a look at that first. When we're talking about the company that's supporting the application, they do have to have been in business in Ontario for at least 3 years in order to be able to support an application. The job offer that they're providing does have to be a full-time and a permanent position. Now, when we're looking at employers that are inside of the Greater Toronto Area, they have to be able to show that in their past fiscal year, their gross income has been at least $1 million. And currently at the time of when they're supporting the application, they have at least 5 employees that are full-time 5 full-time employees that are either Canadian citizens or permanent residents. Now, if the employer is located outside of the Greater Toronto Area, those numbers decrease. And so the employer only has to be able to show gross income of at least 500,000 in the past fiscal year, and they only need 3 employees that are currently full-time and Canadian citizens or permanent residents. Okay, so with that in mind, let's take a look at the 3 different streams that fall under the employer-based categories. The first one is the international student stream. Now, this is for someone who has recently completed a program of study here in Ontario. PhD programs, master's programs, all of these do count. So you have to apply within 2 years of your graduation. So similar to what we saw with the master's and PhD streams, there is a 2-year window. That program that you've completed needs to be either a 2-year program here or a 1-year postgraduate program. With the international student stream, the job offer that you have that you're using to support this application does have to be a high-skilled position, and there is a specific wage requirement. Now, that wage is based on the occupation of your job offer along with your location of employment, but it falls under what's called the entry-level wage. So it's a little bit lower than some of the other programs that we're going to be looking at. Very importantly, with the international student stream, there is no work experience requirement. So again, as soon as you're done your program of study, the international student stream is something that you could be looking to apply through because it doesn't necessarily have any work experience that's required for it. The second stream that falls under the employer-based categories is the skilled worker stream. Now here, with the skilled worker stream, again, you do have to have a job offer. It has to be a high-skilled position. The wage requirement is a bit higher than when we were looking at the international student stream. Here is the median or prevailing wage, so it's higher than the entry-level wage. And very importantly, with the skilled worker stream, you need to have at least 2 years of work experience within the past 5 years in the same occupation as your job offer. So what Ontario is looking for is to make sure that the position you have been offered that you're using to support your application, you have 2 years of experience in that same occupation code, and that 2 years has to be within the past 5 years. Now, those 2 years are not, it doesn't have to be in Ontario, it doesn't have to be in Canada, it can be anywhere, but they are looking specifically for 2 years of work experience. With the skilled worker stream, though, we don't see anything about education. So there's nothing that says you need to have, there's no minimum education requirement for the skilled worker stream. The third stream with Ontario that falls under the employer-based categories is the in-demand stream. Now, this one's a bit different in the sense that the in-demand stream, they have a list of occupations, and basically your job offer that you're using to support your application needs to be from those list of occupations. Now, this is the only program that we see where we can include, where Ontario has included low skilled positions. So it may be that, you know, if you haven't worked in a low skill, but maybe your spouse has worked in a low skilled position, that's on the list of occupations for this in-demand program, they may be able to apply for permanent residence through Ontario. But Ontario has a list of occupations, includes low skilled positions. And so your job offer has to be on that list of occupations. And in addition to that, you do have to have at least 9 months of experience in Ontario within that same occupation. That work experience doesn't necessarily have to be with the same employer that's supporting your application through the OINP program, but you have to be able to show that you have accumulated a total of 9 months of experience in Ontario.
All right, so there's one more option that I like to canvas with you guys, and that's a startup visa. Oftentimes, you know, we get a lot of people coming to us who, you know, you may have been working on an incredible invention or a project, and you're ready to start your own business. So the startup visa is for those who are looking to start a business that is innovative in Canada, and if you get the support of a VC angel investor group or an incubator that belongs to the Startup Visa program, then you can apply for permanent residence. You can also get a work permit in the meantime to work in your business. So it's not just you, you can apply with up to 4 other people. But the requirement is that the people who are applying own the majority shares of the business. So it can't be that, for example, you're teaming up with another Canadian, that person owns the majority of business, you're owning a minority share. You should be owning the majority of business. Or you can team up with someone else and together you guys own majority of the business, okay? You have to have an active management role. You know, this is a good program for people who don't have that, you know, the points for express entry, or are not, you guys really want to start your own business, and because self-employed work does not count towards Canadian experience class work experience, this might be an issue. So here's an option that sometimes we suggest to people who might fall under certain circumstances. All right, so we've talked a lot about different rules, different policies, and it can get kind of confusing. Here's some practical advice that we can help you.
The first thing is that, of course, you know, coming to sessions like today, it's great, but it's really just the tip of the iceberg, right? You do really need to make sure that you have an immigration plan that's tailored to you. And, you know, like Elizabeth said earlier, we're really only talking about some of the more popular programs. There's definitely other programs out there that may work for you better. And so it is really important to make sure that you have an immigration plan that's based on your background, specific to your circumstances. And generally, you know, what we recommend is sitting down with an immigration lawyer who can go through your circumstances and create that plan with you, so that you know exactly what you need to do to get to your immigration goals.
And once you have a plan, the second part is to execute. It could be that working as a postdoc may not be the best path towards permanent residence. It may be that you need to you know, find another job, or study for your IELTS even more. Whatever it is, once you have that plan, you have to have the determination. If you want to get permanent residence, most of you are in a very, very good position to get permanent residence, but it's a matter of figuring out exactly how to do it and what you need to do to maximize your chances.
And right away from today's presentation, we started talking about this right from the start. It's really important that while you're here in Canada, that you make sure you stay in status. It becomes infinitely harder if you lost your status, or if you're trying to apply with no status at all. It's really, really important to make sure while you're here in Canada, keep your status, stay in status. And at the same time, when you're submitting your extension applications, or when you're submitting your permanent residence applications, don't misrepresent yourself. It's, you know, misrepresentation carries a very heavy penalty to it. For anyone who is found to have misrepresented themselves in any immigration application, you can be barred from applying again to IRCC for 5 years. And then even after those 5 years, of course, it becomes much more scrutinized if you're applying. When we talk about misrepresentation, it can be something very simple, something you just don't understand. I think Elizabeth talked about spouses earlier today. And, you know, even just not understanding a definition of a spouse and thinking, you know, what's the difference between common law or a married spouse? These are kind of things that, you know, you may not realize, but can come up to be a misrepresentation in your application.
And, you know, hopefully this doesn't happen. Hopefully you do it the first time. But if your application does happen to be rejected, do not sit and wait and hope and pray. Contact a lawyer right away. Okay. The federal court notice period is very strict. It's only 15 days if your decision is made inside Canada, 60 days outside from the date of rejection. Oftentimes you think, oh, Canadian officers are nice. I'm going to call the call center. That's what they're there for. They're there to help me, right? And okay, so you eventually call the call center and they might say, oh, okay, well, just send a note to immigration and they'll, sort it out for you. And so you think, oh, great, I'll just send a note and explain what happened. And then you get a rejection at the end. And then you go to a lawyer like me and say, hey, this is what happened. Now, can you help me? At that point, you're one step too late because the immigration rules policy is they will only consider one reconsideration. When you send any sort of note to the officers saying, hey, I think you made a mistake, that's a reconsideration. If you don't know how to frame it in the sense of what the law requires, they might dismiss your reconsideration request. And then you may also be out of time as well to go to federal court if you wait too long. So whatever it is, don't try to deal with the immigration system by yourself. The immigration system is very confusing. It is full of different sorts of policies that change all of the time. And mistake of law in Canada, unfortunately, is not an excuse. So even if an officer or the call center, tells you to do something and you follow their instructions to your detriment, the entire fault is placed at your feet because you were supposed to know somehow. Okay, so do whatever you do. Hopefully, you work with a lawyer in the very beginning and everything goes smoothly. But if anything goes wrong, don't just, think that, okay, it's so easy to fix. This is not easy. Make sure that you contact a lawyer right away. All right, so here's our information to contact us. If you have come to this webinar and you wanted to have a consultation, do let us know you've come to this webinar. And we'll give you a discount on the consultation for CUPE members. It's only $100 for the consultation. Yeah, we are happy to help you make a plan for your own situation. All right, Zia, let's go through some questions.
Sure. So the first one here that we have for you, Elizabeth, does experience as a graduate research assistant during my PhD in the US, will that count as work experience?
Yes, I would qualify that as saying if you're being paid for it, right? It could certainly count as work experience. Depending on your hours, we'll have to see, but it's certainly something that very well could count as foreign work experience. Is it possible to file a work permit extension application on paper?
So IRCC now requires, it's actually mandatory to file applications online. There are very, very limited exceptions to that, where they'll accept a paper-based application. But for the majority, basically right now, it's filing applications online.
Yes. Sometimes you may be able to file at the port of entry and just go to the border to apply for a work permit as well. All of that has to be discussed with the lawyer to advise you on which one is appropriate. When is the earliest date we can start applying for a visa extension? I'm not sure if this person is asking about a visa or maybe a work permit extension.
So let's talk about a work permit. If you're applying for a work permit extension, I mean, you can certainly start applying. It really does depend on the type of application you're submitting, in terms of what the eligibility is and when you would be eligible to actually submit that application. But I mean, generally submitting an application 6 months in advance is usually fine. With a visa, it depends. So the difference between the work permit and the visa is the work permit is your status document here in Canada. whereas the visa is your entry document. That's what allows you to enter Canada. And it's only required for certain people who are from particular countries. With the visa, if you need to apply for a new one, generally you need to make sure that you first have your valid status document, and then you can submit that visa application if you're applying from inside of Canada. Next question here for you, Elizabeth. So someone who is on an open work permit, they plan to apply for an employer-specific work permit. Does the kind of work permit help anything for permanent residents?
So in this situation, I think what they're thinking about is the arranged employment points, the 50 points that you can get on arranged employment for express entry. In this kind of situation, I wouldn't know for this person specifically, because there's different factors that come into play. Yes, an employer-specific work permit can give you 50 points, but only if, like a postdoc work permit can give you, but only if you have worked there for at least a year, and by the time you submit your application, you have a contract for at least a year and a half, because according to the law, in order to have arranged employment, you have to have a job for at least a year after you get permanent residence. So if your contract is going to expire in a year and you can't prove that you're going to have another contract afterwards, that could be an issue to proving that you have arranged employment.
So there's another question here, Elizabeth, that's really very similar to it, and it's just asking the same a similar question. So someone who's here doing the postdoc fellow with their postgrad work permit, that postgrad work permit and the job offer, does that still give them the 50 points?
So the postgrad work permit itself, if you're on a postgrad work permit, you don't get 50 points. You have to be on the employer-specific work permit. Now, by the time you get on the employer-specific work permit, if you had a year of work experience with the postgrad work permit, that's fine. That satisfies criteria A. But criteria B, you still have to have that job offer for another year and a half when you submit your application. Okay. Does the GTS exemption include working in STEM fields in academia?
Yeah, so when we're talking about applying for the GTS LMIA, part of it is, so one of the ways to apply for a GTS LMIA is based on your occupations of your job offer. So as long as your job offer is a position that is an occupation that's listed as part of the GTS program, then yes, it can be a part of it.
I would say, you have to be very careful. If you're, for example, in engineering, but you are really teaching engineering, that doesn't necessarily equate to being, for example, a software engineer that's on the list. That, they would say, equals to being a lecturer or a postdoc. There's actually a specific occupation code for that. So it really depends on what exactly your job offer is going to be and the occupation that we can say that you're going to be doing. Okay. Can I apply for express entry and non-express entry streams at the same time?
Yes, you can. Definitely, yeah, it's definitely an option. As long as you're eligible in both programs, you certainly can have profiles in both the express entry and you can have a profile in the express entry system and be looking at creating profiles in Ontario's non-express entry streams at the same time. That's completely fine. The next question here, we mentioned that we should still have at least 1.5 years contract after fulfilling the first year experience to be eligible for CEC. Is that correct?
No, not for CEC. CEC is Canadian Experience Class. You qualify for that, you just need 1 year of work experience that's high skilled. You can qualify for it. What we're talking about with the 1.5 years on the contract is for arranged employment points. So that's after you qualify to get into the pool, you need to have the points. So arranged employment is very specific to get the 50 points for arranged employment. Does the university qualify for the employer requirements under the $1 million gross income?
I would assume so.
Yes, but you
Yeah.
have to also understand that the $1 million income that you're referring to probably is for the OINP.
Yeah.
And one of the requirements is that you have a permanent job offer. And so if you're on a 1-year, 2-year contract, that wouldn't necessarily satisfy the OINP.
I think you've just actually answered the next question. In the skill OINP, the job needs to be permanent, or is the only requirement for 2 years of work. So yeah, so for all of the employer job offer streams in OINP, so that's the international student, the foreign worker, and the in-demand. For all of them, the requirement is that the job offer has to be permanent. Elizabeth, does a common law partner count as a spouse for immigration purposes if applying as a family is only one person designated as the applicant?
Okay, so we didn't really talk about common law spouses. It is very important. So basically in Canada, not only does married count as having a spouse, but there's also a common law relationship that counts essentially as the same as a married spouse. The definition of common law in immigration is the person that you have lived with in a conjugal relationship, so certainly not, roommates or whatever, but in conjugal relationship for at least 1 year. It's only 1 year. Mark that time, because once you have reached that 1 year, and if you're in a relationship with that person, on all of your forms, they will ask you, what is your marital status? And you have to accurately state that you're a common law. Otherwise, it would be a misrepresentation. Okay. Now, talking about having your partner be on your application, each application has a principal applicant. That's the person who, most of the criteria is going to be pertaining to them. In Express Entry, if you have a spouse who is an accompanying dependent who's going to get permanent residence together with you, their circumstances can also count towards that. Okay, so for the most part, and every situation is different, but for the most part, we usually encourage a person to bring their spouses and their children, and for them to together get permanent residence together with you. Because eventually, if you want to be together as a family, it's much easier to have them as an accompanied dependent with you compared to, only you getting permanent residence and then you sponsoring them. And be very, very cognizant of the fact that you can't just lie and say, oh, I don't have a common law spouse, and think that it's easy. Okay, because if you don't declare your common law spouse, later on, if you want to sponsor them, that they could find that not only can you not sponsor them because you didn't declare them before, because you're barred from doing that, but it's also misrepresentation on your part. So even your own permanent residence can be taken away. The law is complicated. I mean, you can, for example, say, I have a accompanying spouse. I don't want them. I have a spouse. I don't want them to accompany me right now. You can do that. But certainly, most of the time, we find that families can work together, can double team. For example, if you are, not able to get permanent residence, you don't have a permanent contract, but your spouse is able to have permanent residence, and they can qualify in your program, like caregiver program or skilled trades program or something like that, they might be able to be the principal applicant easier than even yourself. So if you are in a relationship, you're married, you have common law spouse, it's best to have both people come to the consultation so that we can evaluate you as a family as a whole. Okay. Zia, to be eligible to enter the Express Entry pool, do you need a minimum of 1 year work experience in Canada? If your first language is English, all your education degrees have been obtained in English, you're from a Commonwealth country, are you still required to sit the IELTS exam?
Okay, so for the first part of that, in terms of being eligible for express entry pool, you need a minimum of a year of work experience, but not necessarily only in Canada, right? So when Elizabeth was going through the different programs that work with the express entry system, there were multiple, right? There's the federal skilled worker program, and then there's Canadian experience class. You could qualify under the federal skilled worker program, which requires a year of work experience. That work experience can be anywhere in the world. It doesn't have to be just in Canada. So that's one way that you could use a year of work experience that you have outside of Canada to be eligible in express entry. Now, if you're looking at Canadian experience class, then yes, you do need a year of, you need at least 1 year of work experience in Canada that you obtain while you're not a student, in order to be eligible to go through the Canadian experience class program. With regards to the second part of that question, English can be your only language, all your education, everything can be in English, but it is still required, unfortunately, to get either the IELTS or the CELTIP test. So having a language test is going to be a requirement for most programs, right? So for example, if you're looking at express entry, that language component is there, and so you would have to do the IELTS or the CELTIP test. Elizabeth, can I leave Canada while waiting for the renewal of my work permit, or do I have to stay in the country until I get an answer?
If you are on implied status, if you leave the country while you're, so basically your current work permit is expired, you've applied for another work permit, you're still waiting for that new work permit. If you leave during that time, then your implied status is over. And when you enter Canada again, you won't be able to work until you get your new work permit. And even your work permit applications, technically, if the officer knows that you're outside, technically they're supposed to reject your application. So in those kind of circumstances, it's very important when you're on implied status to stay in the country. Now, if your work permit hasn't expired yet and you want to travel, then that's another matter. You probably can travel, no problem. But very important to understand, if you leave Canada when you're on implied status, when you come back to the country, you may need to apply for another work permit if you are even able to do so. So contact a lawyer if that's the circumstance. How long does processing for the bridging work permit take? They would like to apply after their express entry application has been submitted.
Yeah, so the bridging work permit is generally still the same processing time as a regular extension. Right now, you're still looking at about, I think it's about 5.5 months. So it doesn't necessarily change because it's a bridging. It follows the regular processing times. If someone has an employer-specific work permit and their spouse has a spousal open work permit, can the spouse apply for an extension before the employer-specific work permit extension is submitted or approved?
So if the spousal work permit is based on the employer-specific work permit, then you have to qualify for the work permit somehow, right? So if you're applying for a spousal work permit and there's no application that is outstanding for yourself, then why would the officer approve it? That being said, there's a special policy this year where they are just automatically giving people who have open spousal work permits, if you apply, I think it's 18 months. If you're opting in, if their work permit expires between August and December of this year. This is very, very special policy. But otherwise, if it's outside of that period, your spouse's work permit has to be dependent on yours. So open spousal work permit is dependent on their spouse having a job. How can you prove that your employer will extend your contract? Should your employer give you a letter or new contract?
It depends on your circumstances, right? It depends on what the discussion is with your employer, what documents you're able to obtain. Certainly employers, if they have already issued you a new contract, then that's fantastic. Certainly you can put that in the application. But I mean, every application is different. And so what we do with clients is when we're preparing your application, we're going through what you are able to provide, what your situation is, and working with you to get the documents that you need in order to make your application as strong as possible. I'm applying for a job as a research associate in the field of ecology in Alberta. Employers currently doing the LMIA. Biologists are regulated in Alberta and I'm not registered yet. Can this be a reason to reject my work permit or the LMIA?
This is way too specific for us to give you an answer. We would certainly have to look at the application and speak to the employer before we can give you an assessment on this. Do contact us if you want, you know, but we don't normally comment on an application unless we are the representatives on record. How does writing a French exam count towards express entry? How good does my results have to be?
So in express entry, you get points for language proficiency in both your first and second official language. So it could be that English is your first and you designate French as your second, or if you're stronger in French, that can be your first and English can be your second. It just depends on how proficient you are. But basically there are two categories of points. You would get points for both your first and your second language. And then additionally, if you have completed both the French and the English language exam, and you've scored well on both, you've scored well, I think it's CLB 7 on the French exams, in every category, then you're going to get additional points as well for that, for being bilingual. So it does really give you quite a benefit in terms of points for express entry.
All right, Zia, we're almost at the end. Let's do one question each, and that's all we can do today. But these are excellent questions, though, I must say. All right, let's go. Next question.
So the next one I have here, what job offer is considered permanent?
So a permanent job offer is something where it's indeterminate end. They did not specify an end date on your contract. So yeah, if my new postdoc offer starts from September 23rd and expire December 2025, and my profile is in pool now, and I was invited by September 2024, does my offer still have sufficient time?
It'll depend on when you're actually able to submit your application. When you're actually submitting that PR application to see if you do have sufficient time at that point.
Okay, guys, thank you so much for joining. And thank you so much, Christian and Shanice, for hosting. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Thank you so much. I mean, obviously so much important information. And listening to that, you know, I was just thinking, sounds a little bit like a full-time job, just navigating this. And so it's probably a good thing that, you know, people like Elizabeth and Zia are there to support people. But I was also thinking about, you know, if your actual full-time job is as a postdoc at the University of Toronto, where you have so many responsibilities, we hear all the time, more and more responsibilities, and dealing with really low wages, right? It can be really hard to navigate things like this that you need to do to take care of yourself and your family. The permanent job thing is interesting to me. There are a lot of questions on that. And of course, postdocs are kind of by definition limited, but we also have a lot of cases where postdocs have their contracts renewed and renewed and renewed. And oftentimes that might not happen until like a couple of weeks before their contract might end. And there's a lot of concerns for international workers around visas and that kind of thing. And so these are some of the things we're trying to change through this round of bargaining. So I hope you're convinced of the necessity of that. Pay is really important. Of course, our base floor pay is $36,000. So but you might be wondering, and this is my kind of final comment is, and if you're somebody who's having to think ahead to things like applying for PR, it's like, why would I get involved in a contract campaign? I don't have time, right? You might be looking for a permanent job, that full-time job. But I guess the two things I would say is, one, if the bargaining committee has power at the table, we'll be able to negotiate, and I hope we will, terms that will cover the current year, right? So if wages are increased in 2023, our collective agreement expired at the end of last year, those wages will apply retroactively. So that's one thing to keep in mind, right? And the other thing is that, you know, postdoc positions are kind of a product of precarity in the university. But one thing we know for sure is that universities increasingly need postdocs, right? We see the level, we see the number of postdocs at universities growing and growing. And that's because in some sense, it's the work that's in demand. And so for those of us who are coming after us, you know, PhDs, people who are working on their PhD now who might become postdocs, you know, I think owe it to them to try to create a better environment for them. And the final thing is that what will happen for us in this round of bargaining, you know, CUPE 3902 has really led the way in changing the status of postdocs, you know, from trainees, quote unquote, to employees. And this round of bargaining also will have real knock-on effects in academia more broadly, right? Someone mentioned a research associate and that kind of thing. If the status of postdocs is improved for us, it will mean that other jobs that we're maybe looking for in the future will also be better jobs, because it will lift the general status of all workers who are maybe not that tenure faculty position. So I did figure out how to post in the chat there. That was possible. So you'll see there my contact information, and also our lead steward's contact information, also a link to the survey and bargaining pledge, which you can sign to show your support. And then I really just encourage you to consider becoming a contact action team member. It's a way for people centered in different departments or centers to be the kind of point person for keeping others informed about what's happening at the table and in the campaign more broadly. So it's not a huge responsibility. You know, it's just about being connected and connecting others in a kind of web format so that we can keep everyone in the loop. So that's all I'll share, other than I hope that, I forget that in these web seminars, we don't get to see so many people, but I hope that having listened to me a little bit and hearing my kind of attempt to frame the concerns that Elizabeth and Sia were going over around immigration, and trying to connect it to the bargaining campaign, that you might reach out to me or Andre, our lead steward, and get involved in the campaign. Thanks.
Yes, and Christian, you know, I have to say, I've worked with many different unions in my work, and I would say foreign workers are some of the most precarious workers, and it's very difficult with the imbalance of power, where they have to only work for one employer on their work permits, for one person to raise any sort of concerns with the employer, because all they can say is, no, I don't want to. And so when they are part of a union and the union is able to speak on their behalf, and they have that, they kind of just kind of rebalance that power a little bit. That is super, super important. And I think, you know, postdocs, you know, you guys do incredible work. I mean, all of the education and skills, and to only get that little amount of money, and, you know, to have situations where, you know, the length of the contract is really not supportive of permanent residence. Postdocs should be, you know, the people that the government wants to have. I mean, if we don't want you guys, who the hell do we want, right? And so I think what the work that you guys do is just incredibly important. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, have a great day, and take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.